All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to Dahlia and everyone who made this special issue happen. And thanks to everyone for being here last session of the conference on a Saturday. So thank you all for being here. I will be presenting on the American case. I'm Jake Barnes. I am the research project manager at the Workplace Justice Lab at Rutgers. I wrote this paper with Janice Fine, who is here, and she will jump in on the Q&A, as well as Hana Shepard, a sociologist and a close colleague of ours at Rutgers. So in this article, just to give a little bit of a sense of what we'll be talking about, we're taking a broader look, understanding how federalism has created both opportunities and challenges for workers, employers, and agencies tasked with enforcing employment standards. So we are particularly looking at wage and the enforcement of wage and hour standards at all levels of government. And we contextualize the discussion with a conversation of the history of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the flagship U.S. wage and hour law passed at the federal level as part of the New Deal in 1938. It's setting minimum wages, maximum hours, overtime, things like that. And it is still today at the federal level the main piece of legislation in the U.S., still dictating minimum wage rates, overtime, et cetera. But for more than just that, it has sort of reverberating impacts on legislation throughout the country. So we'll be bringing in some history from that, and ultimately we argue that American federalism has provided significant yet decidedly uneven opportunities for substantive improvements in labor standards, as well as for policy and procedural experimentation around implementation and enforcement. But how did we get there? So a little bit of background. Only a small percentage of workers today, about 6% of private sector workers in the US are protected by a union contract. Here we just have the graph of union density all the way back from 1880, and the numbers are way too small to see here, but where that starts to go down in the yellow is in the 50s into the 60s when union density started to decline. And right around that same time, this graph shows it starts at 1960 and goes up, but this shows employment laws as a share of all enacted laws by session. So showing kind of as union density has gone down, the share of employment laws that have been passed at the state level, I should say, sorry, this is at the state level, have gone up. This is from our colleague Dan Galvin. And so this rise of state and particularly local legislation in the past 30 years has been called by Janice and Michael Piori this new labor federalism. And as we showed, a lot of opportunities and challenges that come with that. But the American system of federalism is perhaps unique in its complexity in that, this is what a lot of people think of when they see the US, they see the 50 states. But these 50 states are broken down further into over 2,000 counties. But wait, there's more. This graph, which I mean, this is a data scientist put this together in 2016. This is the U.S. divided into the most local subset of government, so townships, cities, everything in here. And I wish I could say that this shows the full complexity of things, but it doesn't because there's just so much. Like, for example, California here looks a lot like the rest of the Western U.S. There's over 80 incorporated cities in Los Angeles County alone, other than Los Angeles. So it's just incredibly, incredibly complex system. So, of course, a lot of opportunities have come with that. About 30 years ago was this movement to pass legislation at the local level started in Baltimore with the Living Wage campaign in Baltimore, where unions, worker advocacy organizations came together and got a living wage law passed, which increased wages for workers involved in municipal contracts with the government or the city of Baltimore. And over the next decade, I think it's something like 120 cities, towns, school districts, local forms of government passed these living wage laws, and this ended up culminating in the first minimum wage law passed in Santa Fe, New Mexico in 2003, and then San Francisco in 2004. And since then, over the past 20 years, a lot of this policy formation has happened at the local level. 64 localities have raised their minimum wage above the state or federal rate. 15 states, 17 cities, and 4 counties have enacted paid sick leave laws. Major cities like Seattle and Philly, Washington, D.C., 12 states have passed domestic workers' Bill of Rights, which provide a number of necessary rights to domestic workers. As I'll talk later in the presentation, domestic workers have largely been left out of a lot of this policy at multiple levels of government. More than 150 cities and counties have enacted ban the box laws, which removes conviction history questions from job applications, and predictive scheduling laws, and a whole lot more. But a lot of this is happening at the local level today. But of course, with this proliferation of law, there's also way more opportunities to break the law. So we find, wage theft is an enduring issue across the country. An EPI study showed that wage theft costs workers nearly 3 times as much a year as larceny, burglary, auto theft, and robbery combined in the United States. And we find, this is a national issue, but it varies importantly based off the jurisdiction as well as sectorally. This is just an example. This is a selection of some of our minimum wage violation studies that we've done, where we use data from the Current Population Survey, which is the major nationally administered survey by the U.S. Census Bureau, to look at how workers have been paid underneath the mandated federal, state, local minimum wage that applies. And generally we find, as you can see, I don't know if you can read the text underneath these covers, it ranges from millions to $1 billion a year across these states that are lost to minimum wage violations. But again, this is just the tip of the iceberg in that, minimum wage violations are just one of many forms of potential wage theft. And yeah, just to show that it's clearly an issue throughout the country, but it really varies. So figuring out and unpacking that. So in terms of these opportunities, federalism promotes the development and diffusion of labor policies that rise to 21st century labor market challenges and creative approaches. And it provides opportunities to learn and innovate at all 3 levels of government. And ultimately, these laws have raised standards for millions of workers, and these state and local enforcement agencies have successfully recovered a lot of lost wages for workers across the nation, and critically, frequently with the help of worker advocates and worker advocacy organizations. So we see these opportunities and challenges kind of falling within 4 main buckets: budgeting, staffing, and capacity, specific enforcement practices and strategy, the coordination of enforcement across agencies, and the creation and diffusion of legislative models. And ultimately, we argue that at the local level today, the organizing, coalition building, and policymaking that is happening provides a necessary avenue to address these challenges and ultimately to uphold the rights of workers, given today's political and economic realities. So to go through each of these buckets a little bit, so to bring in this history of the Fair Labor Standards Act like I was talking about, so this is from a memo from 1939, so the year after the law was first put into place. This is a memo from the initial administrator of the Wage and Hour Division, Elmer Andrews, to then Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins, where he is basically saying, so you can see in this first line, I think we might all just as well recognize now that we must reorient our thinking as to the cost of enforcement of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And the initial budget for enforcement was about $4.3 million. And this was in the first year he sent Elmer sent a memo to Secretary Perkins saying, we need more than 4.3 million. We need 11.5 million at least. And that is still, as he says towards the bottom there, an extremely modest one based off of their research of other governments. Did they get this $11.5 million that they asked for? No. The division's budget would not reach $11.5 million until 20 years later in 1961. The $11.5 million that Andrews called for in 1939 then would have been equivalent to about $255 million today, which is remarkably similar to the $260 million budget that the Wage and Hour Division currently has. But of course, back then, there was, 10.5 million workers and 280,000 establishments. Compared to today, not only is there a much larger suite of laws that the Wage and Hour Division must enforce, but it's also a mandate of 165 million workers across 11 million establishments. So a much larger mandate. To put it in a different way, the U.S. civilian workforce has added nearly 100 million workers since 1968, during which the real value of the Wage and Hour Division's budget has grown just 26%. So, at least in the eyes of the original administrators of the law, enforcement of FLISA has never been adequately resourced by the federal government. And this carries to states too. So, for the last year that we have comprehensive data, we have data from 42 states. There are, as you can see, the majority of budget for enforcement of wage and hour protections is in California and New York. 40 other states combined for a total of $45 million in budget, which is about 50 cents per worker. And as you can see, for what we have for local data, goes up to about $6 budgeted per worker. So currently a lot more money being budgeted relatively in these local areas. But as you can see by this bottom stat, there's still particularly an issue with when a mandate is increased, getting requisite increases in funding to deal with that. There have been issues with that in the past. So in terms of staffing, the ILO recommends in developed economies that there be one investigator for every 10,000 workers. We in the US do not quite get there, to say the least. The Wage and Hour Division currently has 720 investigators, which works out to about one investigator for every 226,000 workers and 16,900 in establishments. For states, we have data from all but Delaware, and the situation is pretty similar. In terms of starting pay, so this research at the National Archives, we found that the initial starting pay for federal investigators when the Wage and Hour Division was created and FLIS was passed was $2,600. And that's about $57,000 today. But comparatively, for the 35 states that we have investigator pay for, it's about 44,000. So much less than these workers relatively were making at the federal level when it was first passed. But again, at the local level, we're seeing improvement in that. I put an asterisk here just because we don't have data from a few key agencies. So this isn't conclusive, but it still gives a sense. What we're seeing is that investigators are getting paid a lot more at the local level. And also in terms of credentialing, I won't spend too much time on here given time, but a lot of really important variation in terms of how investigators are credentialed and how civil service classifications in the U.S. are structured, how workers are hired. The required years of education and experience can vary anywhere from 2 to 6 years. The type of education and experience required, most classifications ask for some kind of generic social science background, but there are some that focus more particularly on looking for applicants with criminal justice backgrounds, law enforcement backgrounds. You can see, some potentially important differences in how enforcement happens with those differences in backgrounds. And also, some of these were very, very clearly these classifications were created for the agency. So, like when the Wage and Hour Enforcement Agency was created, so like it's something like Wage and Hour Investigator or something like that. But then many seemingly came from or kind of just adopted from more generic investigator classes that already existed in government. So much broader, and again, just not nearly as tailored towards kind of the skills, abilities, and knowledge that are needed specifically in the wage and hour realm as compared to kind of a more broader inspectorate. So to the next bucket, enforcement practices and strategy. I'll just say here, so again, especially given these limited resources, it's really, really important that agencies are able to use these limited resources in proactive and targeted ways in order to create these ripple effects across industries and be able to create a broader impact of enforcement based than just on the enforcement actions themselves. So a lot of what's a lot of enforcement today, most enforcement today is really based on complaint-based enforcement still, where enforcement actions are initiated only in response to complaints received by the agency, typically in the order in which they are received. Oh, okay. But increasingly moving towards what we advocate for, strategic enforcement. Again, this proactive approach to enforcement where agencies focus limited resources on industries where there's a particular amount of violators based off of this data-driven approach that we take, particularly influential employers, places, again, where these sort of ripple effects may be able to take hold. And critical to this is co-enforcement, which is building formal and sustained partnerships with outside organizations, worker centers, legal advocacy organizations, unions, who oftentimes are much more easily build trust with workers compared to government agencies. So not expecting any of you guys to read this. I will just say for now, this is us mapping different strategic enforcement practices along the line of the case. And similarly with co-enforcement, I'll just direct you for sake of time to our labor standards toolkit. Thank On our website, we have a lot of great papers about strategic enforcement, co-enforcement. If you're interested in these ideas, can go much more in depth. This third bucket, coordination across agencies. You can see from the get-go here, this is from the original Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, and it's still in the law, that the federal government saw the consent and cooperation of state agencies as critical to the enforcement of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And there was a lot of talk about creating these formal cooperation agreements with state governments. And yeah, it was very clear from our research that they were really banking on this system to be created in the years after to fully enforce this law. But by 1954, only three states had signed these federal agreements. So this system never really formed. Clearly this is something that they were banking on. But today, the Wage and Hour Division has active memorandums of understanding with 41 states. Yet the language is minimal. It's very cookie cutter. It doesn't require any form of cooperation or financial commitment. It's very toothless. And there's this law, AB 3075 in California, which was really ahead of its time. The advocacy of Los Angeles worker centers led to the passage, which allowed local agencies to enforce parts of the California Labor Code. But unfortunately, many agency leaders 3 years after the law were still unaware of its passage. So it just goes to show that kind of a lot of the potential extensions of enforcement activities happening were not. And it just wasn't being utilized to the extent that it could. And then harmonization laws, I think I'll skip over that for the sake of time. And then our last bucket, the fusion of legislative models. The increasing number of wage and hour laws and enforcement agencies across levels of government provide important opportunities for policymakers to tailor labor standards to their jurisdictions. The diffusion of legislative models across minimum wage law since the New Deal suggests that policymakers may model policies around those of other tangential overlapping governments. But at the local level today, activists, elected officials, and agency personnel really feel empowered to create change given their proximity to constituents and ability to create novel legislation. And Janice and Hana will be elaborating on that a lot more in a upcoming book. But just for an example, one of the most enduring examples of this is the exemption of farm and domestic work from not only the Fair Labor Standards Act, but many laws that came after it. This you can see from this is an example, or this is text that we found from a committee that was preparing suggested language for a model state bill to supplement the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so not only did they create a model that states eventually signed off on, they voted on it, for it to be the main model for states creating these laws. But you can see here that it came up very briefly about extending agriculture and domestic service to workers, and they were originally they were left out of the federal law, so they didn't have federal rights. And a lot of kind of the deliberation that happened at that time seemed to be, well, that should be a state issue in those industries. But then when it comes to the states, then there's this conversation of, well, we'd like to all see their hours reduced too, but it's just not practical. Farmer legislators would never let it happen. And then the assistant director said they would have to be exempt, and then there was no more conversation on the matter. They ended up being exempt from the model bill. And today, even though federal minimum wage rights were extended to most farm workers in 1966 and domestic workers in 1974, 20 states have domestic worker exemptions that very closely resemble those of the 1974 amendments at the federal level. 13 states have farm worker exemptions that are very similar to the 1966 amendments, again, suggesting this modeling happening. But really importantly, 12 states continue to exempt all labor in or about a private home, and 14 states continue to exempt all labor on a farm with language very similar to the original federal document. Excuse me. So just in conclusion, as labor work and society continue to change over generations and established laws and enforcement processes are inadequate to address these changes, it's really necessary for the effective enforcement of labor standards that states really update these laws in the ways that they need to. But ultimately, it's local governments that we believe provide a place for advocates to experiment with creative policies while focusing on improving conditions within their community. And this is a recent Gallup poll, which just generally shows trust in U.S. government institutions and actors. way too small to see here probably, but the gist, the top line, it says local governments in the area where you live, when it comes to handling local problems, 67% of workers either believe had a great deal or a fair amount of trust and confidence in local governments compared to just 32% in the federal government. So it seems that, not only is this trend happening, but the broader American population sees, has more trust in local governments as it is. So, so yeah, I will stop there. Thank you very much.